Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us on our webinar entitled Guaranteeing a Successful Transition to Oracle Cloud. You're here today with myself, Vicky Briggs, Inoapps' Global Head of Enterprise Change, and my colleague, who I'll allow to introduce herself.
Thank you, Vicky. Hello, everybody. My name is Shubha Shenoy. I work alongside Vicky on the transformation to cloud consulting team. I help clients move either from their on-premises to now the Oracle Cloud system.
Okay, thank you, Shubha. So between the two of us, we will be taking you through our experience and our lessons learned around a successful cloud transition. The first topic I'm going to talk to you about is the importance of change management. If we think about the history of Oracle e-business suite or Oracle PeopleSoft implementations, it was very much about spending a lot of time understanding the structure of the business, detailed functional, non-functional requirements, and then actually shaping the product to meet those requirements. And implementations took a long time, 18 months onwards. And often by the time they were implemented, actually the world had moved on and the business requirements had changed. So that put a lot of pressure on return on investment, etc. So Oracle spent a lot of time thinking about how do we make this better for our customers, and with the move to software as a service and the cloud as a new phenomenon that lots of organizations are adopting, Oracle were in a position to actually offer standardized modern business flows. And effectively, the idea is that for many organizations, there are lots of commodity-based processes that underpin your organization that are very similar, irrespective of your type of business, the industry or subsector that you operate in. And that can be anything from, an organizational hierarchy, a chart of accounts, simple expenses process, purchase to pay processes, onboarding processes. And actually what this means is that by Oracle doing the hard work and actually going out and working out, well, what does a modern business need to operate? That means that from your organizational perspective, you need to think less about the functional configuration, because that work's already been done, and more about how do you align your business to the Oracle Modern Business Flows. And that's a business change journey. And there are three components to think about here, and that's people, policy, and process. And also bear in mind that you will have inevitabilities, which is that you will face on your Oracle SaaS journey, which is that you will introduce change and that your stakeholders will inevitably try to resist the changes that you introduce. And my next slide talks about this in a little bit more detail. So resistance to change. So most of you who have been involved in business change projects in the past will be familiar with the change curve. And actually the dip that can bring in people's passion, motivation, energy, and willingness to commit to new ways of working. And there are four key stages. So the initial stage is denial, as in, I know you're telling me that this change is going to happen, but I don't actually believe that it will happen, therefore I'm going to ignore it and continue in my little bubble. To resistance, to actually individuals fundamentally trying to derail an initiative or point out all the things that might not work. To actually more moving along to a commitment, so exploring actually, I can see that this change is coming, I can see that it's inevitable, so how do I make it work for me, and what does that mean for my day-to-day role, all the way through to commitment, which is, do you know what, actually this change has been pretty good for me, it's good for the business, and I can see that there are benefits to these ways of working. So if we move on to the next slide. So this slide is actually more of a lessons learned slide, and it focuses on when you're about to embark on a transition to Oracle Cloud. Actually, most of our customers and most of the people we've polled and our own experience of implementing both customer side and supplier side, we often find that once the initial planning has been undertaken and everybody's committed to the Oracle Cloud journey, there are quite a few lessons learned that are often overlooked. And I will read through these for you now, which is a lack of top management commitment. So actually, when the strategy is being outlined and we are evaluating products, setting the business case, setting the agenda, there's often a lot of senior stakeholder involvement. But as soon as the business case is signed off and the project kicks off, those senior executives' attention is transferred elsewhere, because there are other initiatives being kicked off to meet the business requirements, meet business needs, and actually that can then result in the project being derailed and can result in actually a lot of the outcomes that were set out in the business case not being achieved. So one of our recommendations is that we make sure that there is strong executive sponsorship throughout the life of the project cycle. inadequate attention to business outcomes and a real understanding of the benefits and return on investment. So I'm sure we've all been in the scenario where as soon as the business case is signed off, it gets filed somewhere and it sits on the shelf and gets really, really dusty. And actually, when people are going through making design decisions and structuring the new way of working, they actually forget to look back at, why did we set out on this journey in the first instance? What does good look like? What's our benefit model, and what outcomes are we trying to achieve? So one of the key pieces of advice that we give to our customer base is, at every stage, every key design decision, make sure you understand, how does this decision affect the business case? How does this decision affect the outcomes that we are trying to achieve? Another component is not having sufficient customer side business resources in terms of the volume of resources required to support the transition, but also the competency and skill set that they require to support the transition. And particularly from an Oracle Cloud perspective, it really is a different mindset to traditional implementations. And you actually need both a skill set in terms of understanding the business from a process perspective, a policy perspective, and a people perspective, but also the culture of actually making decisions in a cloud-based transition. Another component is poor project design and management, so lack of an overarching business plan. And this is effectively trying to avoid silo-based thinking. So if you are running a transformational project across many work streams and many business areas, you may have a project where you're trying to change both the finance and the HR function in the organisation, plus have other transformational activities going on the peripheral that will have an impact. And it's often really, really easy to become very blinkered and focused on your component that you need to achieve. So you need, if you are leading the finance work stream, you'll be very focused on making sure it's right for finance, as opposed to sort of taking a step back and having a look at, how do the decisions that I'm making today affect the wider organisational design and the wider business outcomes. What we won't do is read through, in the interest of time, we won't read through every single item on this list. So I'm going to choose 2 more to go through. But you will have an opportunity, if you are interested in understanding more around these lessons learned, to contact us. So you can contact me at vicky.briggs@inoapps.com, and I'll happily go through any questions and answers with you. But we'll choose one more, which is inadequate training and education. So as part of the Inoapps change journey, and we'll talk through it, actually my colleague Shuba will talk through this a little bit later when we go through business impact assessments and stakeholder profiling, but it's really important to make sure that both your project team are trained and educated in the new ways of working with Oracle Cloud, but also your end users, your end stakeholders, and that they understand this not just from a which buttons do I press within Oracle perspective, but also from a how does this application operate in our world, in our organisation. How do I operate in terms of being compliant from a process perspective, a policy perspective? How do I be a good citizen effectively? Okay, so if we flick now to the next slide. And this slide talks about Inoapps' embedded methodology, and we call it an embedded methodology because it takes all components of a successful cloud transition and incorporates them. So we cover everything from actually how do we make the right design decisions and configure and test from a quality assurance perspective your solution and get you live in Oracle Cloud, to also how do we support you in understanding what your vision is for your organization. How do we support you in modelling your transition, so aligning your business processes and policies, understanding stakeholder impact, to assuring outcome quality, so making sure that you have a robust quality assurance process in place around user acceptance testing, data migration, the right quality of training and communications, and also thinking around continuous improvement. So if you think about Oracle Cloud, actually with the SaaS world, once you're live, every 6 months, every 12 months, there will be updates coming out. Those updates will bring improved functionality, and on a regular basis, you'll need to be looking and assessing what components of that functionality do we actually want to embed into our business model. The last point I'll put into this slide is actually we focus on having a combined project team with a strong vision and strong leadership, and that's a combined team from both a customer and an Inoapps perspective. So we try to make sure we have a culture where we're working shoulder to shoulder for the same outcomes. So I will flick to the next slide now. So we won't spend too long on this slide, and again, if anybody has any questions or would like to understand a little bit more around the enterprise change services that Inoapps offer, you can contact me, vicky.briggs@inoapps.com. But here is a summary slide that gives you an overview of the type of business transformation and business change services we offer. And that's everything from customer side project management, policy reform, target operating models, and stakeholder engagement. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Shuba, and Shuba will talk you through our business alignment process. And Shuba, just let me know when you need me to flick to the next slide.
Great, thank you, Vicky. Yeah, next slide, please. One of the key components of the change management piece is the business alignment. Vicky mentioned earlier with regards to the Oracle Cloud product offers the functional business flows, and you will now have to take what you're currently doing in your company, in your HR business flows, and align that with the new modern business flow. And what you see in front of you here is an example. One of the ones we see a lot of our clients are looking to change or looking to adapt to is the recruit to onboarding portion. So you're managing the planning with regards to if there's a new role within your company or if it's a backfill, and then you go into creating a vacancy within the Oracle Cloud system. And then of course, the next piece of a recruitment workflow would be managing sourcing, and then screening that candidate, either the background screening, drug testing, anything else your organization has already approved ahead of time. And you can integrate that with the system. And then of course, moving on to generating an offer, onboarding to new hire, and establishing alignment and compliance. And you would do that, of course, with the reporting piece. Another example would be the absence planning to productivity improvement, where you are defining the absence policy, creating the rules and controls. You're enabling the employee self-service or ESS, and then managing the entitlement and payments within the system, monitoring absence trends and analysis, and finally managing the preventative actions. All this again is a sample of a business flow in the Oracle Cloud offering. Next, please. So one of that is, how do we do that? How do we prepare for the business alignment? On the left of this, you'll see that there's policy, outputs, regulatory, statutory, and then risk appetite. And when you align your business flow with these key components, the output, of course, should be business architecture. And that's with any of the Oracle Cloud products. Next, please. Great. So this portion would be the business impact assessment. Earlier, Vicky talked about taking what Oracle provides with you. Oracle has done the work for you. Now you're using what Oracle provides, and you're getting into the why is it different. This is where the business impact assessment will play a key role. The questions you're asking is, and I'll read these quickly for you. Why is it different? Who will be affected and how? These are, of course, the stakeholder groups that we'll go into detail later in our webinar. How frequent are these stakeholders exposed to the products? Is this business critical? Consequences if you don't make the change. If we don't adapt to the modern business flow, how does that affect our organization? What does good look like? Again, this is just another way of saying best practice. When you work with our consultants, we will work with you to ensure that you understand what best practice is and help you incorporate that to your organization, to your HR workflows. What will prevent success? And these are questions you have to ask as far as, is it the stakeholder group? Earlier, Vicky talked about kind of the key risk factors. You'll analyze that in the business impact assessment here. Why are we making the change? And again, it's not just our C-levels decided that we're going to go with a new product because it's cost effective, and maybe that's it. But it also could be to align your company to be more compliant, to work better against your competitors. So these are just examples of why we find organizations make that change. And finally, why would my stakeholders care? What's in it for them? We always find that anytime you go through an implementation, you also have to look at your stakeholders as well, and that's part of this business impact assessment. Is they're looking at it from their worldview, their day-to-day job. How will this new system impact their day-to-day work life? Next, please, Vicki. Okay, and I believe this is the last slide on the business impact assessment here. So I'll quickly walk through some of the key steps. First, it's talk about completing the alignment, and that is, you're reviewing all the other pieces outside of the system. And next, you'll talk about selecting the business flow. This is where you would identify the scope of your business and incorporate that into an assessment. The second one talks about understanding changes. These could affect any of the following: process, policy, outputs, peripherals, outcomes, risks, and barriers. Then we talk about identifying stakeholders, who, what, why, how many, what is the frequency that they might be using the system. Are the stakeholders internal or are they external partners, vendors? And keeping in mind that this hits a great point, which is stakeholders don't necessarily have to be employees, don't necessarily have to be line managers. It could also be vendors, consultants. And then, of course, talk about the outputs from the business impact assessment, and then champions. These are the stakeholders that are going to help you make the transition. And finally, we talk about the key messages. This is communication that you will work on for these key stakeholders. We like the sell-tell model. Sell, of course, are when you're selling something, what are the advantages of incorporating the new Oracle system? What are the opportunities it will now give your stakeholders? What is the rationale for the perceived disbenefits? So those will be your sell messages. And when it comes to tell, it's more on what is the message? When will we send the communication out? Why are we incorporating a new system? Why is it important as an organization, as a stakeholder? And then who is it impacting? Next slide, please.
Thanks very much, Shuba. Very, very informative. So in the next few slides, you're going to hand back to me, Vicki Briggs here, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about policies. When we went through the business impact assessments, one of the components of that is, well, what's being impacted by this change? And very often you'll find that policies are impacted by the change. And one of the services that we offer as part of going through our business impact assessment and then creating the business transition plan is actually helping our customer base understand how to restructure their policies and how to make sure that there is the appropriate compliance model in place to support the policy process. So what's a policy versus a procedure? So a policy is a deliberate system of principles to guide decisions and achieve rational outcomes. They provide a statement of intent, and while procedures are practical applications of these policies, they are not the actual business rules themselves. So an example of a policy would be a scheme of delegation for financial approval. So it may be that an organisation has a policy in place that says that there should be separation of duties. So if you are buying goods, you should not be self-approving buying those goods, and that they would have a scheme of delegation of financial approval in place that says if you are at this level in the organisation, you will have approval to sign off up to X thousand pounds. And that would increase incrementally as you go up the hierarchy chain in the organisation, so that a director may be signing off something in the region of £1 million, whereas a line manager may have sign off of up to £10,000 per order or per budget item. When we are structuring policies, we like to make sure that there is a purpose statement. So why is the policy in place? That you outline the scope of the policy and where it's applicable. You make sure that everybody understands the dates that the policy is in place for, who has responsibility and accountability for the policy being enforced, and that you provide a little bit of information around the background, the motivating factors, the reason the policy is there, and why it's of benefit to the organisation, and then any key definitions. Okay, and then some hints and tips around successful policy management. So keep the policy simple, easy to locate, make sure that everybody knows where the policies are, make sure they're easy to interpret, and make sure they're easy to manage and update. One of the key lessons learned that I have is that you need to keep your policies separate from your procedures. So there's no need to mention which specific systems you use in a policy. That can be in your procedural notes, and it means that the longevity of your policy will outlast any system or process changes. Where their exception processes are applicable, make sure they're clearly defined and robustly managed, and make sure there's a fit for purpose compliance model in place. So a policy will only be followed if the organisation understands the consequence of not following that policy, and there needs to be a robust compliance management process in place to monitor and check that compliance is in place, and actually to put a consequence in place for non-compliance, and make sure that the policies, as I've already said, require minimal maintenance. So do not build in procedures into the policies or refer to specific systems. Okay, so I am going to hand you back over now to the lovely Shuba, and she's going to talk you through stakeholder engagement.
Great, thank you, Vicki. Next slide, please. Great. So stakeholder alignment. Again, we talked about, who are stakeholders, either they're employees, internal, external users of the system. On the top of this, you'll see that there are stakeholder categories and how the stakeholders perceive. Are they excited? Is it more work? And this is how you would break down your stakeholders. Are they better service, in control, or are they worried about, what about me? Am I too busy? The other piece is the stakeholder competency. How often are they using the system? So you look at the usage level and their skill set, and the output would be the engagement profile. The picture you see all the way on the right that says stakeholder profile, and that again talks about how do we categorize these stakeholders? Is it interest? Are they low interest, high influence? And then towards the bottom there, you'll see that there's stakeholder engagement structure. This just talks about, the intensive, focused, passive. Again, you're categorizing your stakeholders, and this is to help you figure out, how do we put our stakeholders in the correct categories. The next one here where it says stakeholder learning cycle. This just talks about, how do we go from either transferring, is it a new hire? How do we transfer the knowledge? This is more of the training piece. How do they learn? What is the best way to train somebody to use the system? And then is it internal, point of need learning, etc. The final one you see here is the stakeholder adoption metrics. Are they resistant to the change? Are they unaware that there's a new system being integrated, or are they engaged? Next slide, please. So similar to the business impact assessment, there are, I talked about the outputs that come from the business impact assessments. You now take that and you move it into the profile stakeholder. How do we identify the categories, the subcategories within the hierarchy? How do you access perception of change from stakeholders? Maybe it's interviewing them, maybe it's getting a key group together for a roundtable, but you're trying to take their competency level, do they have a computer, or do they mostly use handheld devices? You have to take all that into consideration, and then you map the influence and interest. In the previous slide, you had seen sort of the different captions of, how do we their influence, their interest, and incorporate that now into these key steps. Next would be the training analysis, the training need analysis, and how do we understand that? How do we then take all this information from the business impact assessment, the stakeholder profiling, and then move it into more of a tangible training portion? So you have to understand all of these categories to achieve that. And then, of course, reviewing key messages. What are the key takeaways from these messages? And the sell-tell model will be very important here for your communication. And then finally, planning. Prepare your stakeholder, as far as the stakeholder user engagement and the user adoption strategy. So in the final portion on the plan is you now take all of this hard work you've done and put it into a plan phase. Next, please. So again, a little bit more on the stakeholder mapping. We've talked quite a bit about these kind of different categories and how do we group them. Understanding of, in the middle you'll see customer vision, and that's obviously your vision. And then of course you take that and you break them into groups. You'll see that we have them as group A towards the bottom left, B, C, and D, and just to quickly go over them, Group A would be minimal effort. They're low interest, low power. So really, you're not really doing too much. But Group B might be low power, high interest, and maybe you just keep them informed. And then Group C would be low interest but high power. This would be maybe your C levels, your higher up. And then finally, Group T, you engage them closely, high interest, high power. So you ensure that when your communication does go out, you target that appropriately. Next, please. Great. I'm going to hand it back over to Vicky now.
Thanks very much, Shuba. That's great. So we're going to now talk about additional key customer components. So these components are value add to change management. So they're not traditional business change services, but they're important to the successful transition to the cloud and getting you the right outcomes. And that's about having a good, robust test management framework in place so that you are understanding sort of during the business alignment stage, you should be working on your test strategy, thinking through the test protocols. So how are you going to prioritize and score any defects that arise? What's the definition of a defect versus a change request? And also making sure you understand actually, what are you going to test? So what are your test scenarios? What negative testing are you going to do? So obviously people focus on testing to make sure that the system operates in the way they expect it to operate. But what we also need to do is make sure that the system has the right controls in place so that it doesn't operate outside of the business rules. So for example, if you have a business rule that says that your lunch expenses cannot exceed £5 or $5, then making sure that the system doesn't allow you to put a lunch expense in that's more than £5 or $5. And the same around approval rules, etc. So if you only have approval rules for approving up to £1,000 or $1,000, making sure that it routes in the right way. So we call that negative testing. And then actually looking at, okay, so we understand what our test scenarios are, what data do we need to support those test scenarios, which roles will undertake the testing, and just making sure that the testing is scheduled and actually you have sufficient time to run sufficient cycles to get a clean, signed off UAT before you sign off go live. If I flick to the next slide now, the next topic is, so you've been through UAT, you've successfully signed it off and you're ready now to go live. And actually the next question is, are you operationally ready? So all of the activities and the thought process that we went through during the business impact assessments, working out what policies and processes are impacted, who needs to be trained, has all of that been completed? Do finance understand how the new world will operate for them? Do they understand how to do month end, year end, etc.? Do your stakeholders know who to call if they've got any problems or any questions? Do they understand how to log in, etc., etc.? Do they understand the new business rules that they'll be working with? In addition to that, there are more practical components around the go live cutover process, and actually preparing for, once you've completed user acceptance testing, there will be a final data migration that needs to be completed. So before you go live, you're going to need to run some validation checks at go live, reconciling data, making sure if you've got 1,000 employees in your legacy system, there's 1,000 employees in the Oracle Cloud system, etc. And so just thinking all of that through and having worked out the timing that each of those activities will take to make sure that you've got a successful and well-planned go live process. Again, we have a lot of information that can support our customer base on preparing for operational readiness. And if anybody would like to talk that through in more detail, you can contact me, vicky.briggs@inoapps.com. And here is an example of a go live operational readiness dashboard from a HCM perspective. And that's covering all the points in sort of the last 8 weeks before go live that you need to be monitoring closely. So have you got the policies and processes ticked off? Has the business signed off the solution? Do the business understand how their processes will work? Have you got your senior user validation in place ready for go live? Have you completed your relevant reconciliations? Actually, have you tested your interfaces? Which, there's also an element of configuration that will happen at go live, because during testing, you won't have wanted your payments to actually go out the door. So you'd have mock tested your backs transfers. and you'll be needed to switching on your live backs and your live email and notifications during the go live process. The other part to consider as part of preparing for go live is actually your transaction cutoff dates. So depending on the scope of your project, you may be covering finance and therefore expenses, purchase orders, or covering HR and payroll. It's that in the run up to go live, there will be a cutoff point where you actually want to encourage your stakeholders to be processing expenses earlier than the normal cycle, processing invoices earlier than the normal cycle, so that you can actually freeze your legacy systems and turn them to read-only, so that you have a nice safe migration point where you know there'll be no further changes for your final data migration load. You'll need to make sure you communicate that clearly in a timely manner so that you don't upset your stakeholder groups, and also that you have a process in place for catching up with that data entry after go live. And here, coming sort of more towards the end of our presentation, we have some hints and tips for go live. So individuals may need access to material for multiple user profiles, e.g. a CEO would need general users, budget holders, line managers and senior managers. All roles will need information on where support can be obtained, e.g. training and process for reporting. Communication should ensure that guidance is provided in relation to both general usage and what is expected in month 1, month 3, year end, etc. And go live communications should complement the standard project stakeholder engagement communications, plan and training, and this should be supplementary information, repeating or embedding key guidance at the relevant time. And okay, so finally, just to recap on the role of business change, we talked earlier about cloud transformation demanding that stakeholders adopt new business processes and new ways of working, and we see the role of business change as being making sure we're focused on outcomes, taking a holistic view and being joined up in terms of service design, engaging with stakeholders, catching practically whatever falls between the cracks, and having practical common sense implementation planning. And thank you very much for listening.